Hey, welcome back to another episode of Real Estate. Today we've got Julia Fagin, sales executive at Fidelity Title. We're going to be talking all things title for buyers, sellers, and realtors as well. Appreciate you tuning in. If you haven't already, would really appreciate you following and subscribing. You can find me on Instagram at Millennial Mortgages. Appreciate you tuning in. Welcome back to another episode of Real Estate. So excited to have Julia Fagin here with a 10-year sales executive with the largest title company in the country.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
So really just excited to have you on. Would love to, let you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you found yourself in title.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to everyone and let everybody get to know me a little bit more about company and a little bit more about what title insurance does. So yes, I've been with Fidelity for 10 years. We are the largest title company in the world. We're a Fortune 500 company. We're an A+ rated carrier. What I think people seem to forget about title insurance in the real estate transaction is that this is a living, breathing policy, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. What I love about being in this industry is the opportunities I get to help people, help them grow their business and really understand how title insurance is a benefit to them in their home ownership as they grow their wealth.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit kind of like how you landed in title, right?
Sure. Well, my actual background is in media management, and my husband got a job offer out here in California. They said we could live in San Diego, so I jumped at the chance.
Don't blame you.
After spending 6 long winters in New York, although I love Manhattan, it was wonderful to come out here and be in the sunshine. My mom was a real estate agent in Scottsdale, Arizona for 27 years, so I sort of grew up in this business.
Yeah.
I have done all the same things a realtor has done. I've door knocked, I have cold called, I have sat open houses. And at the time, I was offered a position to come work for Fidelity Title. And I thought this is just such a great opportunity for me to use all my skills. I have a lot of experience with development, business development, marketing management. So taking those skills and applying them to title as a sales executive, or what people commonly call us as title reps. I like to elevate ourselves and call us sales executives, so you know that we're coming from a different perspective to help agents and lenders kind of work their businesses and grow and be prosperous.
Yeah, and that's kind of a perfect segue, because I was curious, like you talked about door knocking, cold calling, and doing all these things. I was wondering kind of what the day-to-day just looks like for
Sure.
you, and what, kind of you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, on a day-to-day, well, first of all, I have a partner. His name is Ryan Petashevsky. We've been working together for almost 7 years now, and I've been in the business for 10. We spend a lot of our time visiting real estate offices or meeting real estate agents either for coffee or whatever, and just sitting down with them and really going deep into a strategic understanding of what their business is. So then we can identify what the holes are. So sometimes we're talking about what they're doing with their sphere of influence, what they're doing in their transactional actions, which would be open houses, cold calling. We want to identify the holes so we can provide referrals and resources for their business. And then talk to them about how they're going to meet other people. What kind of activities are they doing to generate new relationships with people and foster those and keep those going. So that's a portion of our time, and that's basically where we do the relationship building part. The second part to our business is the hardcore research that we do, and we're backed up by teams and teams of people, our title officers, our escrow officers, our customer service, our farming departments, our researchers. We spend time with them researching what the agent or the lender need to understand about the property or the people and their financial backgrounds. Yeah. So that's where we spend a lot of time.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, it's like in the real estate transaction, it's pretty rare that somebody says, well, who's the, title company? who's taking care of that side of things? And I think it's probably just a lack of understanding of what they do. And I think it's really, really interesting that what you spend a lot of your day-to-day time in is almost like business consulting, right? It's
Yes.
so important what you do in terms of helping real estate agents to grow their business, understanding what they're doing, where there's opportunity for improvement, and where you can really make a difference in their business. I think that's probably one thing, but just out of curiosity, if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about, what else makes a difference as far as working with Fidelity versus maybe other title companies, or what you do personally to differentiate yourself versus other, maybe people that aren't sales executives, that are title
Sure,
reps and that
sure.
sort of thing?
As I said before, we spend a lot of time really trying to understand the core basics of a person's business, and then we can identify where we can support them with products and services that we refer to them for resources. I think what separates Fidelity, it's not just the largest because of numbers, it's the largest because of the client services we provide, the level of experience that the customer is going to have. Because in the end, the customer doesn't typically pick the title company. They've heard of this company and that company, but here in California, which is different, every state is different, here in Southern California, typically the listing agents are gonna pick services. So we are spending a lot of our time with these agents trying to help them grow their business in return to earn their title business. And as a result, we have to be able to provide the best service, the cleanest service, the service that has the least problems with it to make a smooth transaction. Because when you're dealing with the most emotional and highest financial opportunity of a consumer's life, that experience is really important to them.
So, it's when you talk, I kind of mentioned, people don't really ask who the title company is, and maybe, it's because, like you said, buyers don't necessarily get to choose who it is and that sort of thing. But I think a big part of it is people don't know what it is. Could you tell me kind of what title insurance is, what it is that Fidelity provides, and that sort of thing?
It's a great question, and we get this asked very often. So the easiest way to explain what a title insurance policy is it's a one-time purchase policy that is purchased at the time of the transaction being closed. And the purpose is to clear the financial liabilities of the previous owner so they are not inherited to the new owner. So you'll often hear people, are you providing me with clean title, clear and clean title? And that is the true basic purpose of a title policy. Along with that, the policy is looking at the property lines, it is looking at the easements on the property, it's looking at any height restrictions, view restrictions, and that is the physical part of the policy because we are insuring at the core the legal description. That is the description that is kind of registered or explained as through the city or the county. And so that's how they identify each parcel or APN, and they're looking at that, and that is what we're insuring in a physical standpoint. The financial standpoint is the liabilities, as again, removing the financial liabilities from the current owner so that the new owner comes in and doesn't incur those when names change hands.
Yeah.
So that's the simplest way to describe it. There's lots of other nuances that come into play depending where a property is located, whether that's on a cliff, near the water. There's a whole lot of things that come into play, but for the most part, that's the baseline.
Yeah, and I appreciate you kind of making it digestible and understandable because when there's so much jargon and practically our own language in real estate,
Yes,
right? So
for sure.
A lot of times people don't even know everything that goes into it. So just knowing kind of what title is good. It's typically the first time I hear people bring up title is when they get either a fee worksheet or a
Yes.
loan estimate, and they start seeing itemized fees of what their closing costs are, and a lot of that is escrow fees, and there's some title fees as well. Can you speak to kind of what it is that's being paid for?
Sure. So the first fee that's involved with title is the policy, and that policy is known as an ALTA policy, the American Land Title Association. So that is a standard policy. It has lots of features in it. The rates for each ALTA policy are set by the Department of Insurance, and every year we file our insurance rates. So it's based on the purchase price. There's a second policy, and that is the lender's policy. And that is if the buyers are receiving a loan mortgage, then they purchase a lender's policy. And the lenders really want that because they have a vested interest in the policy, so you can't really get title, you can't sell a property with a lender without having title insurance for them to protect themselves. What the consumer is typically paying for is the ALTA homeowner's policy. The ALTA homeowner's policy is the standard policy that they receive and that the seller pays for. It's a one-time fee. The buyers, on the other hand, have an opportunity to purchase the lender's policy.
Okay.
For them, if they're getting a mortgage or loan, it's required by almost every lender. You can't really go through a transaction for a lender without having a lender's policy. If it's an all-cash deal, then of course the buyers don't need that. All of the rates for both the lender and the homeowner's policy are set by the Department of Insurance. We file our rates every year. So between companies, this one may cost a little bit more this way, this one costs more a little bit that way, but what you're looking at is the financial solubility of every title company. Swhether they're A-rated, B-rated, you want a really good title company. All the lower fees are transfer tax, the sub-escrow fee if you're using different escrow company, notary fees. Those are all sub-fees. It always depends on the transaction, so can't really talk about numbers at this point, but
Sure.
I think it's the opportunity for the consumer to sleep well at night, knowing that they've received a property that they own clear and fully, that's going to help them feel like this transaction is going smoothly, and that's the point of title.
Yeah.
So.
And I think, if somebody were to see this, right, and understand what title is, they probably wouldn't ask this, but a lot of times people just see an item listed, they don't know what they're paying for, and they say, well, is this required? You kind of answered that. Unless you're paying cash, this is something you need, pretty much. And then, at the same time, are there different policies though? Like, I know you said it differs by purchase price. Are there actually different policies outside of what you spoke about with the Alta policy and then the lender's policy?
Well, there's predominantly there's two. There's the Alta policy, and then there's the CLTA, which the really difference is the California policy. So the Alta homeowners policy is typically for single family and condos. The CLTA is for commercial and vacant land. If a policy wanted to be upgraded from a CLTA, then for a commercial or vacant land, then they have to have a survey to be able to get the Alta policy. There's additional endorsements that can be added depending on the needs of the property or the comfortability. There's a big difference between what a $2 million house is needed versus a $600 million house in terms of additional endorsements that can be added. But that's the simplest way to explain it.
Yeah, and I think it's best to keep it as simple as possible, just in case somebody's not in real estate and doesn't speak the language necessarily. You talk about kind of it's an insurance policy, so if maybe you could speak to a little bit about maybe some common problems that are seen that title insurance would cover, so that people who are buying a house know what kind of coverage they have.
The common problems that come up when we start researching a property are, I think the one that's the most normal is when people have common last names.
Okay.
So here in San Diego, that could be anything from, the last name of Jones or Smith to Rodriguez, Gonzalez, Nguyen, Wong. So when there's a common last name, sometimes my clients, the real estate agents, will say, hey, there's spousal support on the preliminary title report, but the guy is single and has never been married. And I was like, okay, what's his last name? And they'll tell me, and I was like, okay. Then we provide them with what's known as a statement of information for them to fill out, in which they're providing their social security number. And then we're checking that social security number against both the court records and any other recorded documents that are then going to show us whether that spousal support, as an example, really belongs to him. If it doesn't, it's removed because we've now run his name and social security number. So that's the most common thing we see. Some of the other issues that come into play once the transaction starts happening is when the property is in a trust. That's the big one. The goal of a trust is always to protect the owners and the beneficiaries. So we want to be able to see the trust up front to be able to determine who has the right to sell the property and who has the right to the proceeds, because that's what the trust will dictate out with the trustees and the beneficiaries. So we always ask for the trust up front as soon as possible, because we want to be able to make sure that, yes, these people say who they are and they have the right to sell the property. So other things that come up is if the property was in probate, if there's a recent death, if there's been any problems with encroachments on the physical land. So as I mentioned before, there's two parts to the title policies. There's the physical land that we're looking at, the legal description, and then there's the financial liabilities. So through the transaction, we're checking out, we're going through a checklist, making sure all these things are correct and accurate. But those are the common problems that I would say come up. You know, in a very hilly type area that San Diego is, you know, before you get to the flats or the mesas in San Diego, there's a lot of land movement. And, you know, sometimes when this was the wild, wild west, so to speak, you know, that lovely neighbor technically put your fence 3 inches or 6 inches or 3 feet onto your property. And so we're ensuring that those border lines as part of the legal description. So those are some of the things that come up.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, knowing that these are some of the most common problems, I'm wondering if you kind of have some best practices or maybe some advice that you would give to future home buyers.
Sure. For buyers, it is really important to convey what your intention with the property is to your buyer's agent. If you want to build a second story on this property, if you want to put in a pool, a tennis court, a pickleball, anything, what is your intention with the property? Because the buyer's agent will not have that lens of looking through the documentation with the title company unless we know the intent. So a perfect example of that was I had a property a few years ago where the owners wanted to put in a pool in the backyard, and there, I mean, of course there was room for it. However, once we got the plotted easements, there's a sewer line that's going right under that property, and there's not enough room for that pool. So unfortunately, that transaction didn't happen, but the right thing to do for that client was the buyer's agent actually understood what they wanted to put in place. And because of that, then they got the property that they wanted to ultimately. So those are things, you know, the height restrictions is a big one. People want to be able to put 2 stories up and probably see that beautiful ocean view or canyon view. Well, we need to know, we go through the CC&Rs, we determine, you know, what is the height restriction? Some people that live on hills, they want to put view easements in so that they are restricting someone else from going too high to block their view. So those are some of the things that we deal with to assist in the buyers and the sellers in getting to the transaction to close. But I strongly advise, if you're the buyer's agent, really go deep with your clients, understand what their future, you know, they may not be able to afford it now, but maybe that's their intent later. And we want to be able to make sure that they have the ability to do that.
Definitely, definitely. And you had mentioned, just before we started talking about this, you had mentioned encroachments. And I kind of think of that like football, right? There's encroachment. It's like you're offsides, right?
You're offsides.
It's kind of like, you know, it's maybe somebody builds a fence and it ends up being on someone else's property. I'm not sure if that's maybe the best way to describe it, but maybe if you can kind of explain a little more in detail what encroachments are and maybe, you know, how that relates to the title insurance policy and that sort of thing.
Sure. So if an encroachment is already acknowledged by both parties, like they've given permission for a fence to be built a few inches or feet onto their property, if the 2 parties have agreed, they have an agreement between themselves regarding that. However, what's more common is when someone says, that's on my property, no it's not, and we're trying to avoid that conflict. So when a property is brought to our attention that there may be an encroachment, we have a property line inspector come out. He's a third-party vendor, so it's a neutral third party, and they're going to measure that property. They're using the preliminary title report, plotted easements, and a plat map to evaluate the measurements of that property line and how far that encroachment happens. When a new encroachment is discovered, then becomes an exception off the property. Now, then it becomes a question of what's going to be done about it. So with the 2 current owners, if there was no agreement or understanding prior to that's been recorded, always factor is what's been recorded, what's of legal representation on the property, then the discussion happens, is the fence going to be moved, moved or removed? And if it is, then that's taken care of by the current owner and the neighbors. If it's going to be an issue for the new buyer, then those people need to discuss with attorneys any sort of situation that they can resolve that. And that's really up to them, whether that's legal permission or if there's compensation that comes in. It really depends on the situation.
Yeah, and you talk, I mean, kind of in the same breath, you know, about like view easements, height restrictions, and that sort of thing. So when people are, you know, buying a house, do they have, like, is there some kind of negotiation where it's determined, hey, you know, this person, they want to build a pool and maybe whatever. I'm not sure the exact specifics of what the situation would be, but if they wanted to do something and it's not permitted, do they have some way around that, or like you talked about the
Sure.
plotted easements and.
Well, first of all, the first thing you're always going to look at is if there's CC&Rs. And the CC&Rs are going to dictate what is or wasn't allowed. And you have to remember some CC&Rs are no longer in effect. If that home was built in 1959 and those CC&Rs are only going to be active for 50 years, they may not be enforceable anymore. So that's one factor. So that's why we dig deep into the research. If those CC&Rs are currently still active, and if they're written in perpetuity, then it's a question of like, are you going to be able to get to communicate with all the people who have established that CC&R and ask for an exception or a change? So there's a lot of work to be done on that if that's the real issue with height restrictions, with pools, with anything like that. So it definitely depends, but you've got to do the research.
Yeah, when you were talking about CC&Rs, again, there's a lot of things that get glossed over and maybe people aren't familiar with or don't know what they are. So maybe if you could speak a little more to what that is, how they're determined, and that's.
Yeah, covenant conditions and restrictions. They are certainly a guideline, I think, for people to understand what can and cannot be done by the property. And they were established when that subdivision was created. Sometimes they're just managed by people and they're just recorded, or sometimes, of course, there's an HOA.
Yeah.
So it really depends on how those CC&Rs are managed, maintained, and enforced. Sometimes the enforcement part is a little hard, and that can be anything from saying you can never paint your door purple to it's a 30-foot height restriction. So that's, as I said before, you really need to read those both, and that's all parties, the buyer's agent, the buyers themselves. You do have to understand what's allowed with your property, and then of course properties that don't have CC&Rs, then that's a completely different scenario. But the enforcement part, that can be tricky. So yeah. That's a really depends, a case by case situation.
Yeah, and just going a step back to kind of talking about plotted easements. Appreciate breaking that down a little bit. Can you help people to understand the importance of those plotted easements for both buying and selling agents?
Sure. So when you receive the preliminary title report, it is first the verbal description of the easements. Then a plotted easement map. It's color coded, and it will show you with its little legend at the bottom. This little part that's red squiggly lines versus the one with the little blue dots. It shows you typically where the sewer lines are, the piping for utilities, the drainage. There's all different things that can be on a property. It doesn't mean that every property will have all of these, but it shows any sort of easement. There could be an access easement for what's called ingress and egress. That means your access to the property. Your property may sit behind someone else, so it's a shared driveway. That's an easement. And it's not just land. The view easement's an easement that's up here in the air that one can't physically see, but they can't exist. So it's a visual representation on a map that helps you understand where they are on the property, and then the written description will be like, okay, it's 5 feet from the southwest corner extending to the northeast corner. So you've got to look at the map and read the description and kind of use those together to understand where those easements are on the property and how it affects any type of potential construction or reconstruction, such as putting in a pool or a tennis court or a second story or anything like that. So that's what they're for. It's that visual help.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is most important, kind of what you talked about, like even when we're taking an initial loan application, something we talked about is like, okay, well, how long do you plan to live in this house? And a lot of people are like, I didn't think about that. Maybe 3 years, maybe 10 years. And if you're going to be in a property for that long, regardless if it's 5 years, a lot changes in very little time.
Yeah.
So it's really, I think, something that should be discussed as far as, and maybe this is something I bring up to people now in the future just from this conversation, right, is looking into the future, what, if any, and think large, right? Any kind of changes that you would want to make to your property, what are you considering, and then advise them to run this by their agents so they can speak with, you know, a sales executive like yourself so that they know exactly what they're getting into, how to, you know, make sure that they're able to accomplish what they want with the property, and don't later down the line in 2 years when they go to, oh, now you want to build a garden out front or something,
Right.
and you've got issues. So I think that was kind of the most eye-opening thing that you said a little earlier.
Very
is
important.
just looking more long-term. You know, maybe it's not something, you know, you could afford. You know, a lot of people, unfortunately, they're doing everything they can to buy a house, so they're not thinking about, you know, changing a room or adding to the property or something like that. They're just focused on today, and you know, looking further down the line is really going to save people a lot of headache and potentially disappointment right down the line if they want to make those kind of changes or do something to the property. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Adding square footage or a second story, I think, is the most common one that people in general life will see. People's families expand, so if they want to add to that property, you know, how much can they add to that property on that first floor, or can they go up? That's definitely the most common one. So, you know, it's a little bit of family planning, I guess.
Yeah.
Is, you know, or are those grandparents going to move onto the property with you?
Right.
So.
Right. And I guess one thing, just a quick question, I'll let you get back to your day here, but something that popped up in my mind while you were talking about, you know, maybe building a second story and other things. I feel like the hottest topic in real estate right now is accessory dwelling units, right?
Yes.
ADUs. So do those plot easements and, you know, things like that impact that as well? I would assume there's height restrictions on those, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when it comes to ADUs, the first thing is, where is it going to be positioned? So that's why we would look at the plotted easements. But even before that, every property within its zoning has a certain amount of square footage that can be used on a square foot lot.
Yeah.
So you've got to analyze the zoning, and then you go through the city process. So for an ADU, it first becomes whether you can do this based on the city in terms of, before you decide anywhere on the property where it could go, then it can come back and look at us before for any sort of plotted easements. ADU should always start with the city.
Yeah. Well, Julia, I really appreciate you just taking the time to come out and chat with me. I think it's so much valuable information for realtor partners to have, for clients who are thinking about buying a home. And, you know, just having you as a resource for both realtors and clients, especially as we have these conversations about, you know, what are you planning to do with your home, and, you know, what do you see down the line? It's really great. So I appreciate you taking the time, and, you know, I'm sure we'll be talking soon. But
no, I appreciate it. Thank you. I think out of this conversation, I just want, whether that's agents or lenders or consumers, to understand that at Fidelity, my partner and I are really here to be we're consultative in our approach to this business to help the consumer really get to their goals in their property. And with realtors, whether that's the listing side, the buy side, or the lender, we're here to obviously support the transaction for the title side. And then from a business standpoint, we take that approach of referrals and resources so that we can help people and not just say we're providing value, but get to the real part of their business where we're suggesting products and services that are really going to help them flourish in their business and grow.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up again, because I think that's probably a huge area for of opportunity for us to kind of collaborate, because that's you know, really, I think we align very well there in the sense that we do work like business consultants. I was just talking with a realtor last night, and you know, I was talking to her basically saying, you know, I feel like I go more of the webinars and events that I go to are more directed at real estate agents than lending, because, you know, not to pat myself on the back, but I kind of know what I'm doing. And,
I'm so glad.
And then those, you know, those interactions, those webinars, that information is things that I can then pass on to realtors to help them improve their business. And, you know, working as a business consultant like you do, kind of in your role, is what sets, you know, people apart in this industry. You know, there's people talk about that a lot, transactional and relational. Well, if you can help someone to grow their business, I don't think there's any better way to build a relationship with somebody than to help somebody. And Eric Gilman, that's where I was speaking with that realtor last night. Yeah, so he had a little kind of movie premiere for his documentary last night, and he was talking about that. If you have the ability to help someone, then you have a responsibility to help someone. And so what you do and your team does, I think, is a great asset to realtors, and I'm really glad you brought that up again, because it is where I do see actual value in this business, is when we can work together. And I think there's probably a lot that I can learn from you as well.
I have a lot to learn from you too, trust me.
Would love to kind of get together to see how we can implement those things and help more realtors,
Help more realtors, of course. So, well, thank you so much for having me. I love this. This is always fun. Makes me feel like a star.
Well, so glad to have you. So glad to have you. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Real Estate. Hope you got a lot of valuable information from Julia Fagin with Fidelity Title. Looking forward to the next episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.